Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining us. And today on the podcast, we are talking about a topic that is sweeping the country and probably the world. We're talking about the AI revolution, all the things that go into powering your favorite chatbot, your favorite AI tool, whatever you're using to do whatever you're doing. You're probably using AI to do it. And with that comes the proliferation of data centers all over the country. And they're expanding fast. They're building them quickly. They're trying to catch up to the demand for this AI boom that we are seeing over the last few years. And I don't know if you've thought about what data centers do and how they impact the environment, but just the preliminary work that we've seen, we're noticing lots of water consumption, lots of energy consumption, lots of land grabs, lots of pollution, and just a great impact to the areas where they're located and the people who live around them. And so I don't know as much as I need to know, and I don't know exactly where we're headed, but thankfully, there is someone who does, and she is going to join us on this episode of the podcast. Her name is Kibri Everett. She is an environmental scientist, a GIS specialist. She is a consultant. She runs her own company, Key Environmental Consulting, and she is a member of the HBCU Environmental Justice Technical Collaborative, and she is a PhD student in the Infrastructure and Environmental Systems Engineering program at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, studying the environmental impacts of data centers. And so we have the right person to explore this topic with. We have the right person to ask these questions to. And she recently spoke at the Charlotte, North Carolina City Council meeting and advised them with information, with her expertise, to initiate a moratorium on data centers to allow for more study, to allow for more analysis before they continue to build them across North Carolina, across South Carolina, across this country. And so we are honored and thankful to have Kibri on the podcast with us. Kibri, how are you doing?
I'm doing quite well, Leslie. It's so good to be with you today. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you for being here. And for those of you who've been listening, you will recognize that voice. This is not her first time here. Kibri's my good friend. We are from the same hometown in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And last time we talked about the trash pile and we talked about environmental injustice across the South. It was a great episode. But today we are speaking to her about data centers. And so I guess the first thing I want to ask you, because you were talking about this long before it hit the news, long before it became this kind of national conversation. And so what brought you to do any kind of work on data centers? Did you see all this coming? Was it something that interests you in particular? How did you get involved and engaged on this particular topic?
Yeah. Thanks again, Leslie, for having me. Great question. Well, as an environmental scientist and a person who specializes in environmental justice and have been doing so since 2004, I just in general follow environmental issues and environmental injustices across the nation. You know, whether it's the Cancer Alley, the emissions that are happening in Cancer Alley, or the water issues that are happening in Alabama. So I've always been following environmental issues. And I recall hearing Representative Justin Pearson, who represents the Memphis area, talking about this neighborhood called Boxtown in Memphis. And this is the site neighborhood where Elon Musk's XAI has set up operation. And this particular operation, data center operation, is the home of multiple, I can't remember how many, hundreds possibly, of generators that are there causing a lot of air pollution. And so that is, I think, kind of the first instance of hearing about data centers, and I kind of filed it away. It wasn't surprising that this massive data center operation was being established in Boxtown, which apparently was one of the first towns established by formerly enslaved Africans in Tennessee. So just knowing what I know about environmental injustice, environmental racism, and sacrifice zones, that I just filed that away in my mind as, the first issue or the first time I was really hearing about issues associated with data centers. And so I can't recall what year that was. It's been a couple of years, I guess. But, since then, this issue has definitely come to light across the nation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's very forward thinking to think, big data center, big energy consuming facility in a town like Memphis, Black town, Black representatives going all the way back to when it was established. And so obviously your expertise and your background really allowed you to almost see the future and to know that, this is not going to be a one-time ordeal. This is going to be something that's going to really impact these types of communities. And so it's worth investigating and examining more closely. And so that's very exciting to know. And obviously that kind of foresight is going to pay off because now we're seeing data centers all over the place. And we're going to need experts like you to step out in front, share what you know, your experience, your expertise, and to help us think through what we're going to do with this explosion of data centers across the country. And so with that, I mentioned in the intro that you spoke at the Charlotte City Council meeting regarding data centers because they're proposing several of them in Charlotte. And you spoke along with the community members and pressed for a moratorium on those. And so before we get to that specific policy, can you help us understand the landscape of data centers in Charlotte? Like how many are there? Where are they located? How many are they trying to build? How many are on the horizon? What's happening in Charlotte?
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. A great question. Yeah, from the reports I've seen, there are about 40 data centers in Charlotte that exist. 9 of those are kind of in the center of the city, which happens to be the hottest part of town. Those data centers are likely supporting the large banking operations that exist here in Charlotte and other businesses that are, predominant in this town, like Duke Energy and Lowe's. So those kind of corporate and financial operations need data centers. And so several of those are right in the center of the city, in the hottest part of town. I'm sure we drive by them all the time, not knowing they're data centers. They probably, just look like a regular office building, but they are supporting massive computing operations. And then, so out of those 40, 9 are in the center of the city. There are a couple of others kind of on the other parts of town. And then there are 3 that are in the works that we know about. One of them is on the west side of town. The west side of Charlotte is the historically Black part of town. It's a highly industrial corridor. That one that's being proposed there, or that has been permitted to operate and be constructed there, is a hyperscale data center. So we're talking about a 400, I think it's been reported, a 400 megawatt facility. And just to think about that in comparison, the average home, on a yearly basis is using maybe 10 to 20 kilowatts. And so this is a 400 megawatt, so substantially bigger hyperscale data center on the west side of town. It's also just about maybe, a half a mile or so from the Catawba River. And so I'm sure that location was strategically selected due to the proximity of the airport is also on that side of town. So there's a lot of industrial activity on that side. And it's also near a major transportation corridor, I-85. And so when we think about the cumulative impacts and cumulative burdens that it will exist once this data center is constructed, we can expect the residents in that area to be experiencing a lot of burden. So we already have, air pollution from I-85, the traffic there, and the noise from I-85 compounded with the noise that will be generated from that particular hyperscale data center. And the threat to our surface water, the Catawba River, is another thing to consider. And then there are 2 other that are proposed. One of them is in what's known as an edge data center. This is a data center that'll support like fiber optics, perhaps. It's not a hyperscale, so electricity demand is not as great. So it's a little bit smaller. And that's one that's kind of on the east side of town. What's notable about that one is that it's essentially in the backyard of a neighborhood. So it's about 300 feet. I use GIS to measure the distance between this proposed site in a new neighborhood that I could see from the aerial imagery. So it's about, very close to a residential area, that edge data center. And then the third one that's underway and under construction is another hyperscale 400 megawatt data center. This one is called Powerhouse. So the name is fitting, I think, but it's near UNC-Charlotte. I'm not sure what operations or what the plan is for that. But those two that I mentioned on the east side of town and near UNC-Charlotte are just about 3 miles apart. One of them is about 3 miles from an existing data center, and the other is about 6 miles from that existing data center. So those locations, if we look at the census data where those two proposed data centers are going, they're majority minority, and they're also really close to an existing data center. And so when those two are built, you'll have 3 data centers within, a 6-mile radius of each other. So there are a lot of things to consider, which is why we wanted a moratorium so that, people can bring up these issues, present data to the elected officials and the powers that be, because obviously nobody thought, why put a data center so close, to a neighborhood in somebody's backyard on the west side of town, a data center so close to the Tauber River, and what the implications of that. This is why we need scientists and people who can understand, cumulative impacts and data to be at the table when these kinds of decisions are made about permitting facilities like this.
Interesting. And you mentioned a couple of kind of specific phrases about the type of data center that was being built. You said hyperscale, you used some other terms. Could you give us some sense of what types of data centers are being built, what those different types are, what they mean? I guess, is it only based on power consumption or usage, or are there other ways of identifying the different types that are out there that are being built across North Carolina and across the country?
Yeah, they're kind of broadly classified into, I've seen 4 or 5 different classifications, the largest being the hyperscale. These are data centers that, massively strain the electricity grid. They have large land footprints, a lot of noise. They have the backup power generation and high water usage. So that's the one I think that comes to mind for most people. But then there are the what they call co-location data centers. So these are multi-tenant facilities, and these are ones that you probably drive by and may not realize, that those are data centers. And so what you have is, businesses or companies that need, computing power. They come together and they are operating kind of in the same facility to help with the costs, operation costs. So those are the co-location data centers. So you have, less noise impact. You don't have like the large land footprint, but for my reading, these are, rapidly expanding across the country because there's a cost savings associated, when companies can come together and operate in the same facility, kind of use the same computing resources. Not exactly sure, how it works inside the buildings, but that one is a common one. And then we have these kind of corporate data centers. Those are your Bank of America, your banking, financial institutions. Those are, the data centers that they use and house, computers and servers inside of. These are, again, maybe not way out somewhere in a rural area. They may be in a high urban area in close proximity to people, to businesses and to people's, neighborhoods. And so I think there's a computing advantage to being in close proximity to your end user. I think it's called latency. So the transmission of data from the data center to the user is shorter or faster, the closer you are to your end user. And then there are actually, some home-based data centers too. I'm hearing about something called a crypto rig. So people running crypto operations on some kind of server or something inside their home. So those are, have issues as well. They can strain, cause neighborhood blackouts from, the electricity strain, and also present fire hazards. If you're, especially if you're not in a single family home, but doing something like that, let's say in an apartment, for example. They also, contribute to heat and noise as well. And then the last one is the edge data center. These are kind of your telecom type of data centers. These are also likely, not in a rural area, but, closer to urban areas. So those are the 5 kinds of data centers. But again, I don't know that most people really differentiate between them. When they think data center, I think most people are automatically thinking the hyperscale one, the biggest ones that are causing the most damage and requiring the most resources.
Yeah, I know I am. When I think about data centers, I'm thinking about the big facility that's taking up all the land, that's pushing people out and just consuming everything. And so it's good to know how many different types there are out there and what's really going on. And so I'm curious because you study data centers, you're getting your PhD, focusing on this topic. You use GIS to analyze where they're located and what's going on. Very, academic, very scholarly, very detailed analysis, but yet you still chose to step up and lend your voice to an effort to directly address the proliferation of data centers in Charlotte, North Carolina specifically. And so I'm wondering if there was any moment in time, any kind of event, any kind of prompting from anybody that kind of moved you to speak out publicly about it? Were you always the kind of person that always spoke out when these things took place? Like, help me understand how you do that. Because a lot of scholars and academics, myself included, aren't out there. Don't leave the office, don't leave the building, don't leave the campus to fight alongside the communities. And I definitely appreciate that you did, but I'm wondering if that's just who you are or if something happened that said, you know what, I got to get out there and say something.
Yeah. Honestly, that might be a little bit of who I am. I've always, had it in me to speak out. And I've always been a political observer, political junkie, some might say. These issues, I'm not afraid to speak up. And given, the work I do with my consulting, really start my company to be an advocate for those who needed an expert on their team to fight environmental injustices. That was kind of the genesis of why I started the business in the first place, because throughout the years, we've seen so many, especially in the South, so many injustices. In North Carolina, we think about being the birthplace of environmental justice in Warren County back in the 80s, but even present day and more recently, the confined animal feeding operations and all the waste and the siting of those operations in low-income, poor, and minority communities, the spraying of effluent from these farms, and all the other health impacts that are associated with being in close proximity to environmental hazards. And it's always seems to have been, predominantly or historically Black, but Black and brown communities that get affected by these issues and by, corporations coming in and into communities where they think people won't speak up, they don't have a voice. And so, pride myself, on being part of the grassroots and, working with people in the grassroots alongside them, being the scientist and the expert on their team to help them fight these issues as they arise. And so entering the doctoral program too at UNC-Charlotte in the program the degree is called Infrastructure and Environmental Systems. And so I couldn't think of a better issue that is, current than the data center issue and analyzing and understanding the environmental impacts. It seems to be like the perfect case study for that degree program. And so those are kind of the reasons why or how it led me to get involved. And I will say the invitation to speak at the city council came about by my involvement with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg climate leaders. So they are closely working with the city council members who have been speaking up about this data center issue. And so that's how I really got invited to speak because of my involvement with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg climate leaders.
Okay. So it's always been who you are. And so let's talk about the meeting itself then. So I've never been in a city council meeting. I've seen them on television. I've seen clips of different kind of explosive meetings. People like to go viral at the meetings. But tell us about that meeting. So you come in, I'm assuming you and these climate leaders are there, community members are there. How does this meeting go? What are some of the things that you share specifically with the city council that they need to know about data centers? What were the community members sharing in terms of their experiences and their concerns? And what was the ask? Was the ask for a moratorium? Was an ask for not building them at all? What specifically was being shared and discussed in that meeting? And how did you think it went in terms of the way that you were speaking and the receptivity of the council themselves?
Yeah, I think overall, I will say they were receptive because they ended up passing the moratorium unanimously, if I recall correctly. So they were quite receptive. And the vast majority of the speakers were, speaking in favor of the moratorium. I think there may have been, I can't remember the total number, but there were just a handful of people who at the end were speaking against a moratorium. And I guess I should back up and, to get started on how this all unfolded. So before the meeting, which is always held the last Monday of the month, although it was held on Tuesday because this Monday of May was Memorial Day, the last Monday of May. But there were two groups who came together, or at least two groups who came together, and they held a rally in advance of the city council meeting, which is out of the ordinary. That doesn't normally happen, but one of the groups was asking for a total ban on data centers. So they don't want any data centers. The ones that are in construction, they want them stopped. They don't want any more data centers to be permitted here in Charlotte. And then there were the rest of us. And so I'm not for a total ban on data centers, but we want kind of responsible regulation put on these facilities. And so we were all together in advance of the meeting, doing comments. There was, several news outlets there recording and filming us. And then we all went in, or we had to sign up to speak at least the Friday before the meeting. And we were given just 2 minutes. Each person was given 2 minutes to make their remarks. And we were kind of called up in the order in which we registered or signed up. And so there were 4, I think, of us from the Mecklenburg climate leaders who spoke, as well as, several residents who are living near the proposed data centers, the ones that have been permitted and are under construction. Several of them got up and spoke about, their concerns being in proximity to these facilities. And then just the overall, I think another thing that came out that people talked about was the overall lack of engagement to date so far. There hasn't really been any kind of stakeholder engagement or public comment period or public involvement, stakeholder involvement that I'm aware of before these things were permitted. And so people talked about that. And they also talked about, the general concerns that we hear about related to data centers, like, the noise, the water use, and that kind of thing. So those general comments. But one of the groups that was leading the rally in advance of the meeting did put together some recommended standards that they like to see in place. And so I can get into that, but that was kind of what led up to each of us getting up to speak.
Nice. And so, like you said, you spoke, the community spoke, the council voted unanimously for a moratorium. I think I have here 150-day moratorium. And so what does the moratorium do? What happens after the 150 days? And in the meantime, what kind of, I don't know if it's going to be research, if it's going to be analysis, what are some of the things that will be taking place during the moratorium to give the citizens and the residents more guidance or information about what data centers are, what they do, and what it would mean for them to host them in their neighborhoods?
Yeah, great questions. So the 150 days, which is not nearly enough time at all to study. I mean, what the moratorium is supposed to do is put a pause on, permitting or granting permits for any new data centers. They can't go back and stop any that are under construction. The General Assembly here in North Carolina has passed something where I think it's called down zoning, like, a town in North Carolina cannot go and change the zoning of a parcel to prevent a data center from coming in there, something like that. So there are some constraints at the state level too, but this 150 days is a start. There have been in North Carolina at least 40 municipalities or counties that have instituted moratoriums. And I think one indigenous tribe has actually totally banned, I think if I recall correctly, totally banned data centers now and in the future. But 150 days is kind of on the low end. Several of them, the moratoriums I've seen, are, a year or 6 months at least. So there's a lot to do in this 5-month period. One thing that I have heard that the city is trying to do during this time is to gather community concerns and input, something they haven't done as far as I know to date. So that's one thing. But there's also kind of a stakeholder group that's being formed with various experts who might have, expertise in energy, somebody from Charlotte Water, probably, perhaps, public health people to provide some kind of guidance and hopefully develop some standards for the development of these data centers. And so this is an opportunity, for residents to get their voices heard. I'm not sure what's going to happen after the 150 days. I guess that'll be informed by what is learned during this kind of assessment period. But I'm hoping there'll be some good recommendations that come out of this moratorium period.
Yeah, I'm hoping that you'll get a chance as part
I
of your
know.
research to go in there and actually take a look at these centers and get some information and use your expertise to at least help create some of these standards, or at least the guidance that's necessary to really move forward. I imagine the city's probably just going to try to wait it out, get to the end, and then just pick up as usual. So it would be really important to have something in place before then, to at least maybe they can vote on it. Maybe there's some kind of policy guidance or referendum maybe that would say, hey, on future data centers, this is how the process needs to go and how we need to engage. Because obviously we know, electricity bills are going up, water usage is going up, air quality is diminishing, noise, all the stuff from the data centers. We need to really understand and know moving into it and kind of thinking through in a more clear-eyed way how to, merge, blend in together with these data centers. It's going to be really tricky. And so, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's crazy that, whenever like a road is built, or, we all know that environmental impact statements are required for a lot of different infrastructure projects. And so, one obvious thing is that these data, there should be an, EIS done, as well as a health impact assessment too, performed with these data centers. But Action NC, the other group that the Charlotte-Mecklenburg climate leaders have been working with recently on this issue, they've kind of drafted some recommendations that they'd like to see. And I think they're pretty good. And, I recently heard someone say that community benefits agreements are not allowed in Charlotte or not allowed in Mecklenburg County. I don't know where that stems from, but they would like to see some community benefits, when these data centers come to town, like, local hiring commitments, air and noise monitoring, emergency response plans, those kinds of things. But on the environmental front, we like to see some kind of carbon impact assessment, the requiring of renewable energy in some fashion, some kind of constraints on water usage, especially given, we're in a severe drought, have been for a while. So putting some kind of constraints on that. And then also with the community, just allowing some kind of comment period so that people know that these are coming and can voice their concerns. So those kinds of recommendations, I think, will be great for the city of Charlotte to look at, for future data center developments.
I think so too. I agree. And it's interesting. You had that comment earlier about one group wanting a total ban, one wanting a moratorium, and kind of the different approaches people are taking to data centers. I have a quote here from a council member who said, this is not about being anti-growth or anti-development or anti-technology. This is about responsible growth. And so I guess what is, or in your view, what would responsible growth look like when we talk about data centers? Because it seems like they're coming, and it seems like the idea of doing things responsibly could potentially slow down or potentially halt certain things from happening. And so I wonder how you think it through, or if it's even possible for data centers to be responsibly integrated in the communities, given their impacts and given their, effects that it'll have on the residents.
Yeah. I think, there's no stopping data centers at this point. They're here to stay, especially given our need and desire for chatbots and all the generative AI, even though data centers have been around for decades. But, the proliferation that we're seeing now is just because of AI and specifically the generative AI, creating cat videos that are dancing and talking and that kind of stuff. But I feel like in the future at some point, just like, back in the 80s, we had a floor model TV and now we can watch TV in the palm of our hand. Now, I do feel like, at some point, I don't know when, how long it's going to take, but these, hyperscale, large land intensive data centers. Hopefully will be a thing of the past at some point. But yeah, in the meantime, yeah, we do need responsible growth. The city council, remember you mentioned Dimple Ajmera. I think one of the things that she's been advocating for is to make sure these data centers are not, built in close proximity to residential areas. They need to be in some kind of industrial zone only, for example. So that could be something. But the city of Charlotte does have something called the Strategic Energy Action Plan, and it's kind of like a climate action plan for the city. And it focuses on renewable ways to lower energy burden, and reduce greenhouse gases, what can be done with this around the city to lower greenhouse gases and just strengthen our overall climate resilience. And so I think a lot of that needs to be thought about when it comes to data center development here in Charlotte. So one thing I'd like to see as far as responsible growth is, some kind of mandate that, these data centers are not using the backup generators like the XAI is using in Memphis because they just cause so much, air pollution. And actually, for one of my classes last semester, did a cost benefit analysis of a proposed data center in the eastern part of the state. And the developer of that data center was saying the county is going to get on an annual basis $75 million in revenue or benefit. But when I did the calculations and the modeling, even on the low end, the lowest scenario, when we include the social cost of carbon into the costs of these data centers, the social cost of carbon exceeded that $75 million. And so the cost, even on the low end at the lowest scenario or the most conservative scenario, was exceeding the proposed benefit to the county. And that was because this particular data center was planning to be off the grid. And so people might think, oh, they're off grid. So that means, our electricity won't go up because they're not using the same electrical power that homes are using. But instead, they were going to generate all their electricity on site. And so anybody living in close proximity was going to be at risk or will be at risk if this goes through of the air pollution associated with generating electricity on site. So this particular data center, they were trying to tout that, we're going to generate our own electricity on site. We're not going to be on the grid. But what that means is that anybody living in close proximity to that particular data center is going to have to deal with the emissions from the electricity being generated there on site. And so one of the things I would recommend to Charlotte would be, not allowing any kind of on-site electricity generation unless it's a renewable source. But the traditional kind of backup generators, those should not be allowed, not in the city, because it's just going to emit all kinds of pollution. And so, responsible growth, using renewable energy, building these things in some kind of industrial zone, and then making sure consumers and residents are not paying, increased costs associated, with the massive increase in electricity use that these things require. So just, looking at all the externalities and figuring out, how do we reduce or eliminate them to the benefit of the community is what I'd like to see for responsible growth.
Yeah. It sounds like a good plan and something we could all get behind, hopefully, as the moratorium moves forward and that discussion happens, that all these great ideas will be incorporated into some kind of plan moving forward and perhaps be a model for other states, other areas of the country who are dealing with the same issue, to have something to go by and something to use as their strategy to manage the explosion of data centers across the country. So that would be fantastic. And speaking of this explosion, according to the Pew Research Center, the South apparently leads the country in planned data centers and existing data centers. The number I have here, there's 754 planned data centers in the South and over 1,200 existing ones. And so why do you think, or is it fair to say that the South is being targeted for these data centers? And if you think so, why would that be the case? And what does that mean for this kind of fight for environmental justice when we have the same part of the country dealing with another environmentally hazardous industry? What's going on there?
Yeah, from what I'm hearing, one reason that the South is kind of leading the way with data center construction is primarily for two reasons, at least the webinar I was in, this is what they stated, these two reasons. And I'll give a third just based on my experience. But what they said was, the land is cheap here in the South. Land is cheaper. So you can get, into rural areas, relatively easy, I guess. There's plenty abundant land. There's also older infrastructure here. So being able to connect to the transmission lines or, the energy sources are here as well. And then also can be a more favorable regulatory environment in the South as compared to, let's say, the West Coast, for example. So, easier regulations or easier to get around regulations here in the South. But the other thing I like to throw out as a reason is just the historical disenfranchisement that communities here in the South have had to be, confront and be involved with. And so perhaps the developers of these data centers are thinking, these are people who are not going to put up a fight. They don't have any political power, it might be easier market to enter. So I think, those are reasons why, the South may be attractive. I know there are some, environmental reasons, that make the South maybe not as ideal for data centers. I know as far as like the eastern part of the state or the eastern part of the Carolinas, is hurricane prone. And so I think data center developers trying to avoid those areas that might, be subject to hurricanes or other, severe natural disasters. But yeah, they're here in the South, they're coming. I don't think we can stop them at this point. But the other thing as far as, environmental injustice is, that we have to think about is you may have heard of, these power plants that were, about to be decommissioned. I think there was one in South Carolina in Hartsville, for example. They're being brought back online because to meet the energy demand. And so again, these things have not historically been in the wealthy areas of the South. And so, we got to think about the pollution and all the other externalities associated with bringing these power plants back online. And in addition to that, there's apparently a lot of speculation in the market for data centers. Everybody's thinking this bubble is going to burst at some point. And so they're developers building these facilities, but they don't have companies actually go in them yet. And so there's also concern that we're going to end up with abandoned buildings or abandoned sites, in disenfranchised areas that won't ever get used for anything. So we've, cleared trees and caused other issues with the environment for nothing to come to fruition with these data centers. So it's probably cheaper to do that, in the South than it is, let's say, in like Massachusetts or Illinois or California or something. So the South is attractive, for multiple reasons. We know Virginia is kind of the biggest area or the data center capital of the world, being in close proximity to the nation's capital. So, but there are a lot of issues to think about.
There's so many. Let's talk about the economics. We're from South Carolina. I feel like every governor in South Carolina, and I'm sure it's the same thing for a lot of Southern governors, they're always pushing this idea of economic development. So you're talking about how the regulatory environment's different here. A lot of that's for economic development. Tax incentives, tax breaks. We look the other way when it comes to the environment because we want people to come and build and hire people and bring investments and jobs and industries and businesses and activity to the state. And so I'm seeing now that data centers are being touted in many parts of the South as a driver of economic development. And so it's going to bring jobs. It's going to enhance the desirability of our state and of our region. And some reports are saying that there are some increases in jobs. Other reports are saying, hold on, not quite. And, usually when you have something like this come, you have to accommodate its needs. And so you're, like you said earlier, you're bringing back old power plants. You're extending, energy infrastructure. You're coming into water use agreements that are favorable to attract them to come, and you're doing all these different things. The cost, the way they get shared among the residents and the industries is still kind of dark and fuzzy. What is your take? What is your perspective on this idea of data centers being vehicles of economic development in these areas? Do you see that as a possibility? Do you think that's happening? Is it kind of being oversold? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, from my reading and analysis of that one particular data center that I analyzed in the eastern part of the state, it is largely overselling. They're the one in the eastern part of the state that I kind of did an analysis on. As I mentioned, the developer was saying, $75 million in revenue to the county. And that's largely coming from property taxes. So that particular parcel of land is county owned at the moment. So nobody's paying taxes on it. And so once they sell it to a data center developer, then somebody's going to start paying taxes. And so the county does get some tax benefit, but the benefit to the average citizens seems minimal. And in addition to that, there's a lot of revenue being lost at the state level because here in North Carolina, at least, data centers are not required. They're exempt from sales tax on the equipment that they buy. So I don't know how they work that deal out. So they're not paying any sales tax on equipment and the peripherals and all of that goes into these facilities. So that's another major loss. But as it relates to jobs, what we're seeing, there are construction jobs associated with data center developments. Those jobs are transient and they're temporary. It seems like they are bringing in, staff from other places, other parts of the country. They may not be hiring local people to do the construction work. And so, and I'm also hearing, that these large data centers like the Microsofts of the world and Amazons, they are trying to develop, training programs because they just cannot find the skilled labor, the electricians and all the other people they need to build these things. So they're putting money into job training programs. From what the data shows that even these hyperscale data centers, they're, once built and in operation, they're employing less than 50 people at the most. Most of these data centers, the non-hyperscale, may have 10 employees. So really, no, as far as I can tell, there does not appear to be some major economic benefit or boom to this digital infrastructure facilities.
Yeah, I didn't think so either, but I did want to hear from an expert. So, thanks for sharing that. I do think in many instances, especially when we talk about environmental justice and the way that people try to frame the environment versus the economy, I do think that there is a lot of hard overselling of the benefits of allowing these things to come. Especially they want to allow them to come into minority communities, into poor Black communities with the idea that they try to convince them that it's going to uplift those areas. And we just haven't seen them. We haven't seen it with any of these industries that come in, whether it's data centers, whether it's powered plants, whether it's any kind of steel plant or manufacturing. It's just the benefits don't resonate. They don't find themselves among the residents that live near those facilities, but they bear all the environmental burden that those things carry. And so, it's something to think about.
I wish we could, put our focus into the green economy. There's so many jobs with solar and, wind and geothermal, all those other renewable, energy. The green energy economy is where ideally we would be focusing and not these dirty, antiquated, fossil fuel driven sectors. It's just, we're losing our competitive edge as a country by doing so.
Yeah. And I want to ask you about the HBCU Environmental Justice Technical Collaborative. Obviously, it's a network of HBCU researchers, scholars working on various environmental justice issues. How is that network, how is that group approaching the data center issue? I imagine that there are different perspectives, different analyses that are taking place, and different views on how to move forward. And so I guess two questions. One, what perspective do you think that they have that's unique, right? So HBCU researchers are not like any others. We look at things differently. We have different views, different communities that we serve. We have unique perspectives. What do you think that perspective is? What have you seen? And how is that network kind of engaging this particular issue?
Yeah. So, what's unique is that we, HBCU and environmental scientists, geographers, the group I'm a part of, we've each kind of been just deeply community rooted in our work. The founder of the HBCU Environmental Justice Group has worked quite a bit in Cancer Alley with the Bullard Center, with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. And so we are, get out and touch people. And even my first four entrance into this environmental justice work was when I was employed at North Carolina Central University, HBCU in Durham, North Carolina. And I was going out into communities of color. And the project was specifically called Environmental Risk in Communities of Color. So I was going out in communities of color and collecting samples and analyzing them for levels of pollution and contamination. And so we are, out in the streets, and we have been for many years, decades. And so that does put us in a position to work alongside communities in this particular data center fight. And so we just apply, what we have. We're kind of a qualitative and quantitative mix of methods researchers. And so we know how to get into communities and build trust with them. And also we know how to do the technical analyses too. And so that is really what sets us apart from the average academic. And so, the fight that we've been involved with alongside communities over the years, against the CAFOs, for example, or against the toxic industries in Cancer Alley is we could use kind of the same, methodology, being there as a partner to those on the front lines and providing our technical skills and expertise. And specifically, my group in particular, there are multiple of us kind of in this data center front. We're working on that front right now. Me with my doctoral research, here in the Carolinas, because my research is all of the Piedmont from essentially Raleigh down to Columbia, looking at the environmental issues in that region. But then we also have a professor at Morgan State University in Baltimore who is doing some analysis on kind of a demographic analysis or vulnerability assessment and trying to look at patterns of the demographic data in communities that have data centers and what that's showing. And then the founder of our group is at Tennessee State in Nashville. And so he's in close proximity to Memphis and is also involved with some other researchers in the Washington, D.C. area who are doing something with data centers. We're still in the early stages. So we're, working on multiple fronts on the data center issue across multiple states. And just, learning from each other and leaning into communities and learning from those on the front lines.
Yeah, and doing great work along the way too. And we all appreciate it. And there have been some real wins, right? You mentioned earlier there's several moratoriums across North Carolina. There have been several communities across Virginia even that have fought against data centers, kept them from being built. If someone's listening right now and they get wind of a data center coming to their community, what is the first thing they should do? What should they do immediately? Who should they talk to? And how should they engage their local officials? What would you recommend as kind of a on-the-ground community strategy for confronting an oncoming data center to their community?
Yeah, well, I like to say, there's strength in numbers for sure. And there is a lot of chatter online and social media groups. There's so many, data center social media groups online. And so people are really coming together, talking about, what they're experiencing, what they're seeing in their towns. And even to find out, I think social media is a powerful tool to be able to find out when the public meetings are happening, or, people might post the site plan of a data center that's coming. So it's a way to find out information, on the local level where you are locally, but also nationally to hear what the impacts are, and then how other people have successfully put up a fight or gotten concessions from these data center developers. And so I recommend that people, kind of join together, whether it's online or in person, and look at strategies that people are using to kind of get the concessions that you might like to see in your community. And understanding, the costs and the benefits that exist and can come about, when you come together and put up a fight. So I'd say strengthen numbers, get with others, make your voice heard, show up at meetings. And then, if you need experts on your team, that's what people like me, that's what I'm here for, to help people understand, technical information, and to, just lend my support and expertise to the people who are there, in the grassroots and having to deal with the issues firsthand.
Nice. And so you heard it here. So that's the strategy. So the first thing you do is you find out more information, you figure out where the meetings are going to be, and you need to support your community with data-driven analysis. And so you would then call Kibri Everett with Key Consulting, and she would be more than happy to serve you any way that she can, for a fee, of course, but to ensure that we're all in this together and that we all have the tools that we need to fight and to make sure that whatever's happening in your community is happening at the behest of your community and not in spite of your community. And so make sure that you have that kind of conversation, you have that kind of approach. And we keep fighting for justice wherever we are and wherever we find ourselves. And so we're running out of time. I just want to just give you the floor just for a few minutes. Just share with us some things that you're working on. If we want to learn more about what you're doing in your organizations, your consulting firm, all the work that you're putting out, the things that you're involved in, just tell us a little bit more about where we can find you, follow you, and support your work.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Leslie. Again, thanks so much for having me and for allowing me to speak on this topic. I guess, the primary way to find me would be through my website, which is keyenvi.com. That's KEYENVI.com, like environmental. And then social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, the same handle, as well as my HBCU group, also HBCU Environmental Justice. Technical Collaborative is also on social media. And then I also, as you mentioned, lending my support at a fee. I do some pro bono work through a nonprofit called Palmetto Futures, named after our home state, the Palmetto State of South Carolina. And South Carolina is where I'd like to lend my services to primarily, because as compared to North Carolina is pretty well organized. There are a lot of environmental activism, a lot of, researchers, but South Carolina, not so much. And so I named it Palmetto Futures because, my heart is always in Carolina, and I know there's a great need. A lot of fights that are happening across the state and a lot of environmental injustices, but also the need, in my opinion, is greater for environmental expertise. I do some pro bono work through that nonprofit. But just continue following me on social media. I have reports that I'll put out from time to time, some analyses I've done. Also, a lot of the community engagement work I often release and put online as well. So doing a lot of stuff, not just on data centers, but on other climate-related issues and activities. So I look forward to meeting some people and staying in touch.
Absolutely. We look forward to all the work that you're putting out. And we are just so very thankful that you were able to join us today. Thank you for coming on, lending your expertise, sharing with us how you engage the fight and how you've lended your voice in such successful ways to bring a moratorium, to educate, and to uplift communities in North Carolina and beyond. We're thankful for you. We appreciate the work that you're doing. And thank you for being on the podcast with me.
Thank you, Leslie.
And with that, we will end our episode of the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and the planet. We'll see you next time.